Today on our 2016 Chevrolet Traverse, we're going to be taking a look at and installing the SMI Air Force One supplemental braking system for motorhomes with air brakes, and it's a proportional braking system, part number SM99243. Here's what the Air Force One is going to look like once it's installed on the vehicle. We've got the air cylinder here that's mounted to the arm of our brake pedal. What it's going to do is allow this to serve as your supplemental braking system so that the brakes can be applied in the towed vehicle as it's being towed behind your motorhome. It functions using pressurized air from the air brake system on the motorhome. This system is really nice because unlike some systems that are portable that you can switch between vehicles, if you have one vehicle that you're planning on towing behind your motorhome on a regular basis, this is going to be a permanent install, and that way whenever you've got your vehicle in tow mode, you just have to hook your airline and cable up to the breakaway switch, and once you've got your vehicle completely hooked up to your motorhome, you're ready to roll. You don't have to take the time to make sure everything's set up properly. Now from inside the motorhome, it has a monitor light that on this one's been mounted on the dash. You can also mount it on the back of the rear view mirror if you'd like, wherever's most convenient for you. But you can see that when the brakes are applied in the motorhome, that monitor light will come on to let you know that the brakes in your towed vehicle are being applied. That monitor light can be seen through the camera on the rear of your motorhome. The Air Force One is a proportional braking system, so the harder you apply the brakes inside your motorhome, the harder it will apply the brakes inside your towed vehicle. Now, let's show you how to install this unit. We're going to start off by installing the portion on the motorhome, and here we've got our air tank assembly, and we've got 40 feet of DOT 1/4 inch airline, and then here we've got two 5/8 inch hose fittings, two 3/8 inch hose fittings, and then two 1/4 inch, and they're going to go into these two T connectors here, so they'll thread in so that we can tap into the proper lines on the motorhome. And then we've got two 3/8 bolts with flat washers and lock nuts to mount our air assembly unit to the frame of the motorhome. Then we've got some smaller 1/4 inch bolts in order to mount our air fitting that's going to go on the back of the motorhome in order to connect to the towed vehicle. We'll need to do a little bit of pre-assembly before we go underneath the motorhome. So what we'll need to do is take these large 5/8 connections and put them into the sides, either end of one of these T's. You need a 13/16 wrench and a 15/16 in order to tighten that in. And once you meet resistance, you want to get it a few turns in to make sure that that thread sealant that you see there is fully engaged into the threads so that it won't leak. And we'll do the same thing for that other 5/8 fitting on the other end of that T. And then on the other end, we'll take one of our 1/4 inch air fittings and install that the same way, making sure that it tightens to where that thread sealant is fully engaged. So we'll do that same thing just with the 3/8 fittings for the other T. Now before we go under the RV, we need to make sure to drain as much air out of the lines as we can. So with the motorhome off, we'll pump the brakes in order to bleed the air out. What we'll need to do is we'll need to take our air assembly unit here and find a good location to mount it underneath the motorhome. And wherever you mount it, the preferable way is to have the body of it pointing down so that the tank's on top. You can mount it to the side if you need to, but you don't ever want to mount it with the tank on bottom. So on this cross member here, it's got some holes that are already drilled that will actually fit within the slots on our bracket for mounting. So I'll be able to use those, and I'm going to use these upper ones just to keep it higher, as far up off the ground as possible. And what we'll be doing is taking these 3/8 bolts with flat washer, and we'll stick them through. And then on the back side of it, take a flat washer and one of the 3/8 nylon lock nuts and get it started. Do the same thing for the other one here. Then we'll use a 9/16 wrench and socket in order to tighten these up. So then if we move up in front of our rear axle, we've got this large air tank here, and we've got a 5/8 supply line that's feeding it. And inside this loom here, you can see that 5/8 line. That's the one that we're going to need to tap into with our 5/8 T connector. So to get in that, it's got 2 ties that are holding this down. I'm going to cut those so that I can pull that line out from inside the loom. Inside that loom, it's got a 3/8 line and a 5/8 line. Make sure you grab the larger 5/8 line. You do want to make sure that you've bled those brakes out so that there's very minimal pressure left in these lines. Otherwise it can spray out, and if there's any moisture in here too, it could spray all over you. But then take a good pair of hose cutters, and you want to make a nice square cut, because that's going to help make sure that it's not going to leak. So you just slowly cut that. Like I said, there could be a little bit of moisture in there, which is okay. I'm going to use a little bit of rubbing alcohol to wipe off the ends of these lines to make sure that they're clean and to help prevent any possible leaks. Then we can take the T that has the 5/8 fittings on the ends and push it onto our lines. And you want to make sure that it's seated all the way. It'll go in and meet resistance, and then you'll need to push it in the rest of the way until it completely bottoms out. So we'll do that with both sides of it. So now, directly in front of the rear axle, we're going to be cutting into and putting our 3/8 T connector into this 3/8 metered airline right here. And it's the one that comes out of this fitting on the bottom of this relay valve. So now we'll take the same hose cutters and cut as squarely as possible into that line. And then we'll take a little bit of rubbing alcohol again and clean that one up as well. And we'll take our 3/8 T fitting and plug one in to each side. Again, making sure that they completely seat. Now I've gone ahead and routed some of my 1/4 inch airline up towards the supply line, the 5/8 supply line. And I ran it up along the inside of the frame rail. I continued it through those cross members, keeping it tucked on the inside of the frame rail. And then once I got up towards the air tank, I began routing it over towards our T fitting. So then it comes out right there. Now on the end of this airline, I'm going to use a tubing cutter. If you don't have one, you can get one on our site, part number F9009. And then you want to make sure that you've got a good flush cut. You can take that and insert it into the 1/4 inch side of that T fitting. And it's a friction lock fitting just like the other two. So you want to make sure that you get past the initial stop and push it all the way to where it bottoms out and is nice and tight. So then at the other end of that 1/4 inch airline that is hooked into the supply line now, we'll take it and we'll need to cut it to the length we need in order to install it into this friction lock fitting that goes into the tank on our coach assembly. Once we've got our end cut flush, we can install it into our friction lock fitting here. Again, you want to make sure that it completely bottoms out. And then for the one to the metered air, I'm going to route it in the same manner in order to get to that T fitting. And then I'll bring it back here and I'll install it in this 90-degree air fitting that's directly below the tank here. Now I routed my airline from the rear at the hitch, which is where our coupler is going to go, that's going to connect to our towed vehicle. And I routed it along the inside of the frame rail, back up towards our coach air assembly. And back up here, what I'll need to do is make sure I've got enough length that I can come into this fitting that's on the bottom side of our assembly and make it so that there's no sharp turns, so it's nice and looped here. I'll need to make sure I have enough for that, and then I'll cut it in order to put it into that fitting. And with the airline, any place where it's got a decent amount of play, it's a good idea to take a zip tie and just tie it down to something nearby, just so it can't move around too much when you're going down the road. Now at the rear of the RV here at the hitch, we need to take our air fitting, and we'll need to get this mounted up so then we can plug our airline to it and then have our system complete on the motorhome. And for us to be able to mount it up back here, I'm going to use this universal short bracket. If you'd like to get one in order to do the same thing, you can get that on our site, part number 18140. So I'm going to have to drill an extra hole out on here, but then I can mount up my fitting onto that bracket. So I'll just need to make sure that they're lined up. It looks like I'll just need to drill out one hole over here, and I'll just use my drill bit in order to mark that. And then you'll just need to make sure that the screw or bolt that you're using will fit through there. So I'll have to take a little bit bigger drill bit and enlarge that hole just a little bit more. And because of the amount of room that we'll have underneath the back of the motorhome, it's going to be easier to mount up the hardware and the fitting to the bracket off the vehicle. So now we'll need to take our fitting here and mount it to the bumper, and our long bracket comes with this screw clamp. Then we'll need to feed it through our bracket and up over the top, and feed it back in. You can take a 5/16 socket and begin tightening that clamp. We'll need to take the airline that we've got routed back here and cut it to length so that we can insert it into the back side of that fitting. Insert it and make sure it's inserted all the way and locked in place there. Now we can start the motorhome up and let it build air pressure in the braking system in order to check for leaks at all of the new connections that we made. Now at each connection point and fitting, we'll need to spray some soapy water on there once we've built up pressure in the system and make sure that they're not leaking. So we'll be looking for bubbles. And we'll do that for all the fittings that we put in. I've gone ahead and removed the front fascia from the vehicle in order to make it easier to see and give us a little bit more room to work. Because the first thing we need to do is mount up our Air Force One operating unit. I'm going to be mounting it up right up here on the outside of the frame rail. Now, when you mount it, you want to keep in mind which side your air fittings are all on. So that way it's going to be easiest to run your airlines to them. I'll remove this 10mm nut. Also remove 10mm bolt that's right up here. Then we'll take out this 10mm bolt that's up on the side here, and that'll allow this bracket to come loose, which will make it nice and easy to take this arm off. Then I can take my operating unit and I'm going to mount it upside down so that those air fittings are facing up. And I'm going to slide it over that stud. Then I can reinstall the brace that I took off from there. And I'll hold the operating unit at the angle I want it to be mounted and begin to tighten it all back down. And with the base plate that's on this vehicle, it did come with a bracket, so I'm going to use that bracket to mount up my breakaway switch. So I'll mount this up to the bumper here in the center, right above the wiring brackets. And I took the bracket here that's mounted to the breakaway switch and I bent it so that it will match up to this so that it'll come straight out. I get my nylon lock nut started there. Then I'll use a 7/16 socket and wrench in order to tighten up my breakaway switch. Now I'll take the horn off that's on this side. It's just held in by a 10mm bolt up top there. I'll unplug that by squeezing on that tab and set it out of the way. Now I'll use a 1/4" loom clamp in order to put it on the handle on this side. Then I'll use a self-tapping screw to secure it to the side of the frame there. And if you'd like to get one of these loom clamps on our site, you can get that part number A0250. I'll be using a self-tapping screw in order to put that into the outside of the frame. Now, we'll need to find a good location to mount our air valve here on the front of the vehicle. I'm going to mount it to where it's going to come out just to the passenger side of the license plate, because that way it'll be on the same side as the motorhome. Now, at the end of my airline, I'll need to make sure it's got a nice clean cut. I routed the airline from down here by the fitting, up behind the bumper, and then up behind the bracket for the core support, and down, so that I can come down to my operating unit in order to clip this and go to the air in. Now we'll take our air tubing and measure out about the distance that we'll need in order to come down to the air in fitting. And you want to make sure to give yourself a little bit extra, just in case either you don't get a clean cut or you need to cut it again for whatever reason. We'll take that and put that down into the air in fitting. And when you push that down, it's a friction lock, so you need to make sure that you go past the point where you meet a little bit of resistance and go till it's completely bottomed out. Now our other end, we'll need to cut it to the length that we need and then insert it into the back of the air fitting that's going to be on the front of the vehicle. And this has the same type of air fitting on the back side there, where you need to make sure it goes in all the way. So now what we'll do is the blue wire coming off the breakaway switch, we'll need to connect it to one of the black wires here coming off our operating unit. Because the blue wire reaches all the way up here, I'll just clip one of the black wires shorter, and then both ends, we'll strip them back. And then I'm going to swap out the butt connector that they give you in the kit, just because with this being mounted in the location it is, there is a little bit greater possibility that there could be a little water that gets up here. And I want to make sure that this connection isn't compromised. So instead of using the butt connector they give us, I'm going to use one of these. And if you want to get some of these on our site for the install, you can get that part number DW05744-5. And these are heat shrink butt connectors, so they'll help seal it up to make sure that water can't get into the connection. Then I can take a heat gun, but you can also use a lighter. But when using a lighter, you want to be careful not to let the flame have direct contact to the connector. So you just want to heat it up until the sides that are overlapping the wire, until they shrink down like that and look pretty clear. Now I'll take the other black wire, and that's going to be our ground for our operating unit, and we're going to need to ground that to the frame. I'm just going to route the wiring around the edge here of the operating unit. I'm going to clip my wire right there, strip the end back. Then I'll install one of the ring terminals that came with the kit. I'm just going to take it, use a self-tapping screw to ground it to the frame right there. Underneath the driver's side dash, we've got this panel that we're going to need to take down so that we can have access to a grommet and better be able to mount up our air cylinder when we're ready. Across the closest part on the underside of the dash, there are 3 push pin fasteners. You can take a flathead screwdriver, pop the center of it out, then the body of it should pull right out. And all 3 are going to be the exact same thing. Then we can pull the front of this down and pull it out towards the rear of the vehicle. I went ahead and located that grommet, and it's just up to the right on the firewall from the gas pedal. And I also took a utility knife and just put a little cut in it in order to be able to slide my air hose through. So I'll take my air hose and begin feeding it through, so then I can pull it out on the other side. Now I'll need to remove some of this top covering here on the top of the motor in order to access what we'll need to back there, both for pulling our things through the firewall and for getting to the vacuum lines in order to tap into those later. I also need to take the air intake tube off, so I'll need to take this PCV connection off. Just press in on that little gray tab. It should pop right off of there. And then I'll need to loosen up both screw clamps at the throttle body and at the air box. There you can see the grommet from underneath the hood, and you can see that airline coming through. And I'll grab my airline and begin to pull it through. I'm going to pull this through until I've got just a little bit left inside the cap. Now, after we've got our airline pulled through, what we'll need to do is locate the position that we want to insert our T into our vacuum line that's on the vehicle. And we've got the brake booster back there, and this is going to be our vacuum line that's coming up here going towards the motor. I'm going to tee in right back in here. I'm going to pop this off of this clip in order to give myself a little bit more room to work. I'm going to trim this sheath back. Then I can compress it going down back towards the brake booster, because right in here is where I'm going to install that T connector. I'll take my hose cutters and cut through the hose there. Now this vacuum line is 1/2 inch line, but the vacuum line provided with the kit is 3/8 line, and so is the T connector. So we'll need to cut out a short section of this on either end in order to put in adapters to make it that size. So we'll cut out a little bit from each side here. So then on the ends of my fittings, I'm going to put a little bit of dish soap just to help make it a little bit easier to install. And I'll take that and push it up into the line there. And I'll do the same thing for that one down there. Now that I've got that installed on each side, I can take a short section, approximately 1.5 to 2 inches long, on my 3/8 vacuum hose, and I'll cut 2 sections about that length. Then I'll install those onto the ends there. So I'll get a little bit more of my dish soap. Then I'll install one of my short pieces here. So that goes about halfway through there. Then again, repeating that process for the other one. Now I'll be ready to install my T connector between the two. So the next thing I'll do is connect the end of the remainder length of hose that I have to the single side of that T. So now I'll begin routing my 3/8 vacuum hose down towards the operating unit. I routed the 3/8 vacuum hose along the top of the firewall and around the fuse box here and down underneath to go down to the operating unit. Now we'll need to install a check valve in this end where it's going towards the motor. When we install this, we need the black end of our check valve to be pointing towards the motor. So I'll install that into my 3/8 line that I added, and then I'll have to add another short section of 3/8 line to go between that check valve and the adapter. So now that I've got that in, I can take my clip and reinstall it onto the hose so I can clip it back to the stud to secure my vacuum line. I took the airline and routed it along the exact same path that I did the vacuum hose down towards the operating unit. Now I'll take the vacuum hose here and I'm going to need to cut it and put it on to the vacuum hose port that's on the operating unit. So I'll need to get it to the length necessary. Then I'll use those hose cutters to cut it at that length and slide it all the way down on there. Now once we've got it installed down here, we'll need to cut this hose just a short distance up from the operating unit, and we'll need to install one more check valve. And on this one, the black end of it is going to be going towards the operating unit. And after that, with my airline that goes into the cabin of the vehicle, I'll need to get it to length and then insert it into that air out fitting. Again, making sure that it goes all the way down into that so it's got a good tight grip on it. Now we're ready to install our actuated brake cylinder, and when we install this, we'll be clamping this around the arm on the brake pedal. This will be mounted to the firewall of the vehicle, and when you mount it, you want this to be within an inch up or down of straight, both as it sits there and when the brake pedal is depressed. So it can be at a little bit different angle, but then when the brake pedal is depressed and it straightens out, you definitely want it to be within an inch up or down so that it doesn't put too much tension on this cable and possibly damage a component. So now we'll take our cylinder and put it onto the arm of our brake pedal. And you want to put it high enough that it'll be out of the way of the driver's foot, but you also want it to be low enough that it'll still give good effectiveness when it functions. Because if it's too high, it won't do much to the pedal. But the lower it is, the better job it'll do of depressing the brake pedal. And we had to swap out the studs that are here because they were too short to fit around the shaped brake pedal that we had. So we took 4 longer ones, part number SM99604, if you'd like to pick some of those up because you're running into that same issue. We'll get it mounted around brake pedal, and we'll put our plate back on, slide that down, and we'll get the nuts started onto our bolts. And we'll start by hand tightening this just to get it in the position that we need. But something you'll want to keep in mind when you tighten these down all the way is that this is small hardware, so if you over tighten it, you do run the possibility of breaking these. So you do want to be careful of that when you tighten them down the rest of the way. But also you want to try to get this arm in the center, front to back of this bracket. Now I'll hand tighten those just enough to try to get it to stay in position. So now I'll slowly begin to tighten the nuts on here. You'll need a 3/8 socket or wrench in order to tighten these. Now we'll need to mount our little bracket here that holds our cable to the firewall, And I cut out a little section of the rubber and then sound deadening material that was behind it so that we can get directly to the surface of the firewall. But what we'll need to do is adjust this cable through so that there's just a very little bit of slack in the cable when this is mounted to the firewall. Because right now we've got a lot of excess. So in order to do that, you need to take a 5/32 Allen bit and loosen up the set screw. And we can begin shortening our cable. Test it to see it's pretty close to the length we need. We can tighten that set screw back up. And when you tighten that set screw, you don't want to make it too tight. You just want to get to where you get resistance and then turn just a little bit more. So now what I'll do is take this. I'm going to use a self-tapping screw in order to mount this to the firewall there. So I'll take that self-tapping screw. So I took out a little bit more of this sound deadening material under here, and I had a little more room to be able to mount my cable adjustment. Now I've moved the air cylinder down on the arm of the brake pedal a little bit just to help avoid the possibility of this air cylinder shifting and turning to the side when in action, just because of the odd shape of our arm here. Because we had to install those longer bolts, they came over a little far, so I cut the ends of those off with a cutting bit on a Dremel tool so that you don't possibly catch your foot going from the gas pedal over to the brake. I'm going to use a little bit of rubbing alcohol to clean off this center section on the dash, just to give it a good place to adhere to, because that's where I'm going to mount that LED light. You can use this provided hook and loop fastener. It's got the sticky back to it. We'll put it on our LED strip here. Then we'll peel that hook and loop apart. And the other side we'll put on the center of the dash up there. So now we can take our LED strip and put it right there in the center of our dash. And then we'll just route the wiring over here towards the A pillar. Now I'll take this reed switch and I'll slide it into the slot that's on the side of the cylinder here. And we've got that screw that's got a small flathead in it. We want that to be facing out. Take a small flathead screwdriver. You'll need to tighten that set screw down in order for that reed switch to stay in place. And while we're down here, we'll take our airline that's routed through the firewall and we'll plug it in here to the end of our cylinder. And you want to make sure that this one too seats all the way. Now we'll need to connect the red wire here coming from our LED. Because the wires don't quite reach each other, there's some extra black and red wire that comes in the kit, so we'll need to use some of that. We'll need to get that routed so that it comes up and through over here. We'll pull it through. We'll pull it up here. Then we can strip that end back. And then we'll do that same thing with the black wire. Now we'll need butt connectors that come in the kit. And we'll do that same thing with our black wire here. Then we'll take these, pull these over here. Kind of tuck them right in the side there. And then you can use a flathead screwdriver here to then just push that down and tuck it away. Now on each of these 3 wire leads coming off the reed switch, the brown, the blue, and the black, I'm going to put a butt connector on the end of each of them. With the extension wires that I have here, I'll take the black one, which is my black wire coming off of the LED. That's going to hook up to my blue wire down here. So I'll cut the excess, strip the end back, then I'll put it into the end of that butt connector that goes to the blue wire. And then I'll do that same thing for the red wire coming to the black wire from the reed switch. And then this brown wire, I'll be routing out back through the firewall and towards a positive terminal. Now off this black wire, we're gonna need to split and use this three-way terminal in order to send a third wire off. And just need a short one in order to make a ground. So now I'm gonna clip this black wire just right up here. Then I'll also take that third wire. I'll get it installed into my terminal. And I'll do that same thing for these other two. So now with all three of those connected, I'll strip the end back of that extra wire I just added. I'll put on another ring terminal. Then I'll use a self-tapping screw in order to ground this. I'm just going to ground it to the body. Now I can reinstall the cover. I ran the brown wire along the same route that I ran the airline and the vacuum hose. Ran it to this side of the fuse box. Then I'm going to end it right here, so then I can join it up to my orange and black wire from the breakaway switch in order to connect them to the fuse holder and then connect them to my jump post right there. And I'll take my fuse holder here, I'll cut it just a little bit off center, and then I'll strip both ends of that back. And then my orange and brown wires here, I'll be putting those into the same end of a butt connector. Instead of using that three-way connection terminal, I'll take my brown wire and clip it to about the length I'll need here. Strip that back. And then my orange and black wire, strip that back as well. I'm actually gonna take these two and twist them together. Then I can connect one end of my fuse holder wire into the other end of that butt connector. Then I'll shrink them down. I'm also going to be swapping out the ring terminal that's going to be able to mount my wire to my positive post. And the one I'm going to be using you can get on our site, part number DW05705-1. So now on the other end of my fuse holder, I'll install this ring terminal. Pull my cover back here, and then I'll take that nut off and I can install my ring terminal. Now I'll just trim a little bit of that covering right there so that it'll fit. Now we're ready to take our 10 amp fuse and install it into our fuse holder. And then we're going to replace our cap. And now we'll reinstall everything that we removed in order to do the installation. That's going to complete our look at and installation of the SMI Air Force One supplemental braking system for motorhomes with air brakes, part number SM99243 on our 2016 Chevrolet Traverse.
Click the link below to shop, learn more, or visit us at etrailer.com.